Hi, everybody. Greetings. We're glad you could make it tonight. We are presenting this May meeting of the Pasadena group of the Sierra Club. My name is Bill Joyce, and I'm the chair of the Pasadena group, and we're glad you could join us. Our featured speakers for the evening are Kevin Nunez and Nathan Nunez, who are both deeply connected to the Gabrieleño indigenous community. They've dedicated their lives to cultural preservation and advocacy. And they're going to take us on a journey through our local mountains with a perspective that has, for many of us, not been shared before. But before we start our program, I'd like to highlight some of the ways that you can find out more about the Sierra Club. The Pasadena group is part of the Angeles chapter. The chapter is bigger than we are. They cover most of LA County and all of Orange County. And by being part of Angeles chapter, we have a conduit for getting involved in conservation issues that are greater than what we might be concerned with at the local level here in the western San Gabriel Valley. The chapter also has a lot of outings, a lot more than we have, and they're mostly open to everyone, including non-Sierra Club members. You can check them out anytime by visiting the chapter's website. I personally am pretty proud of that. When it comes to hiking the Sierra Club, you don't have to join the Sierra Club. Just come on out and enjoy the hike. We're glad to have you. The chapter publishes two newsletters. One is the Southern Sierran that is online, and the other newsletter is oriented towards some of you who are new to the Sierra Club. It's called SoCal Now, and it comes out quarterly. And it's available both online and in print. So if you join the Sierra Club, I think you might get I can't promise that you're going to get a print copy of SoCal Now, but check it out anyway. Just go to the Angeles chapter website, and if you look at news, there's a drop-down menu, and that's where you can find out about the up-to-date news about what's going on at the chapter level. As far as the Pasadena group, we have our own electronic newsletter that comes out about the first of every month. It's called the Arroyo View, named after the Arroyo Seco, which runs right through Pasadena. And we're very proud of it. It used to be in print, now it's online exclusively. There's no charge. All you have to do is go to our website and click on the link, would you like to sign up for the Arroyo View, and then you put in your name and spell everything correctly, please, including your email address, and we'll get you signed up for the Arroyo View. So check the Pasadena group website for updates, and that's sierraclub.org/Angeles/Pasadena. George Vine is going to give us an update on some important legislation that's coming up at the state level, State Bill 1137. George?
Hi, I'm the Vice Chair and Treasurer of the Pasadena Group, and I want to tell you about legislation called Senate Bill 1137. It was approved by the California legislature last year, and it's a bill that would ban oil and gas drilling within 3,200 feet of residences and shopping centers and community centers and churches and things like that. Anyways, the legislature passed it, and it would have gone into effect, except that the fossil fuel companies were opposed to it, and they went out and spent $20 million to gather 600,000 signatures saying that this should be put on the ballot in November of 2024. Now, I don't know who signs a petition saying that you want drilling within 3,200 feet of your house, but they got 600,000 people to sign that. And 3,200 feet, that distance is scientifically based. There's all these studies that show that people that live within that distance of an oil and gas well are subject to all kinds of respiratory problems, asthma, other kinds of respiratory problems, all kinds of stuff, because those wells, they pollute, they leak organic compounds into the atmosphere, and you breathe that if you're close by. And a recent article I read said that in the state of California, 5.9 million people live within a mile of an oil and gas well. And of those 5.9 million people, 92% of them are low income or persons of color. So it's a real environmental justice issue. So at this point, the Sierra Club is forming an action team to make sure that everybody understands about this issue. And at this point, we're just trying to get the word out that this is going to be on the ballot in November of 2024. Be on the lookout for it, and do not vote in favor of it. Vote in opposition to it, and then let's let the law take effect. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Eric, I think you're going to introduce our speakers tonight. Eric Peterson is our co-outings chair. Eric.
Hi, I'm Eric Peterson. I'm co-outings chair and co-programming chair, and I also coordinate the Henninger Hikes. It is been a long goal of mine to have the next speakers come join us, and I'm very pleased that they are here this evening. I know Bill gave a nice introduction, and they're going to tell you much more than I could, but I want to welcome Nathan Nunez, who is a Gabrielino culture keeper, and Kevin Nunez, who is a Gabrielino culture bearer. And I would ask you to give a nice welcome to our speakers, Nathan and Kevin. Thank you.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Nathan, and thank you, Eric, for that introduction. So I first want to introduce myself to you in my native language, which, again, is extremely important because language to us is preservation of the past, but it's also continuing that culture and staying visible today. Miha noane hapchigna susagna Gabrieleno, netwayane kawa havavit, awish konaha. What I said there is miha, which means greetings and hello in our traditional language. And I said, Noone hapchigna susagna Gabrieleno. I say I'm from the villages of Hapshavit and Asusagna. Asusagna is present day the city of Azusa. Asuksa, Azusa. A lot of people don't know that, but that's the history of the name itself. And then when I say Netwayane Kawahavit, I'm saying my native name is Great Runner. And Kawahavit means that, Great Runner. I always joke that my parents, my dad gave me that name because I ran track when I was younger. I was a very fast athlete. So, a lot of our names, they exhibit the character traits we possess, right? And they tell a story of who we are as a person. So I want to introduce my dad, and I want to introduce a little bit of myself. My dad is, I always say, is a walking encyclopedia when it comes to Gabrielino indigenous culture. And he'll share a lot about the culture and how it's staying alive today, right? But we want to take you through a journey. So we want to take you from this period of, before colonization, before pre-contact, to what colonization looked like for our people, and that difficult road that we had to go through, how it contributed to our erasure and genocide, and the different really difficult things we had to endure as a people. And you'll see that come out in the way we speak today. These will be difficult topics, right? But we want you to know what we went through as a people, what we still go through today, and how we're constantly working to bring back our culture and constantly working to preserve the ways of the old people. And also, too, right, our stories are continuing today, right? So how do we stay visible today? By doing things like this, right? So we want to share our relationship with the mountains. We want to share the work that we're doing up in the Sangro Mountains and the importance of it, and how we want to make sure we're establishing those relationships with all you, and we're all contributing to, in a lot of ways, the same things, right? So again, I'll introduce myself, and I haven't done that quite yet, but again, my name's Nathan. I grew up my whole life basically learning from my dad, and it wasn't until the last several years to where I really started to take on a larger role. And it wasn't because of, I guess, me seeking it out. It was more so because there was a need for it. I'm only 23. And, you know, in our community, we have a pretty decent sized amount of, you know, people in our community. But the problem is the amount of us who actually know the culture and may be able to speak about it in a way like this, which is can be very intimidating, right? Takes experience, takes, you know, a lot of confidence, right? And I remember the first time I did a speaking engagement like this, it was really difficult. And I think actually I may have told Sarah, who's here in the audience, at one point about this, but because she's a professor at APU, and I did a lot of close work with her when I went to APU. And I did a speaking engagement, and it was in front of a crowd at a Rotary Club, and it was this very difficult crowd to speak to, you know. And I learned a lot from that speaking engagement. That was my first speaking engagement. So, again, just to share more about who I am, you know, I grew up, you know, going to powwows. I went to different cultural ceremonies with the Gabrielino San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians. I learned how to sing and dance. I learned the ways of our people. I learned how important the culture is to us. I learned the language. I learned different traditions and customs that we had, right? But a lot of it was me listening, me learning and learning from the elders above me, all right, and giving that respect, right? Because for us, respecting those who've come before and respecting, you know, the ways of our people is really important. And that has to be shared, because I'm not here because of me getting here. You know, I've done a lot of great work, but it's because of the people that I've had around me, because of my dad right here, who's endured a lot, which, you know, he'll probably share at some point today. But it hasn't been easy being a Native American person. And there's a lot of stories we'll share in regards to that. But, you know, I grew up in the powwow community, so, you know, I grew up dancing in the own powwow community and just sharing culture with different cultures and to where I'm at today. And today, I do a lot of work in the San Gabriel Mountains. I had an organization, still have an organization called the Canyon City Environmental Project, where the whole point of that organization was to take people up into the mountains and share about the pollution that's happening up there and start to take action against it, right? And actually, hopefully, make a change, make a difference. And a lot of that work has led us to where we're at today, where we're doing culturally guided work, where we're working with the U.S. Forest Service and working with the different conservancies and agencies and different outdoor access groups to have and facilitate these conversations on sustainable recreation, right? Sustainable in funding, but also sustainable in the sense of how do we recreate, but in a way that's also protecting nature? How do we preserve spaces that are sacred to our people, but also sacred to all of us here, right? So we want to make sure that we're engaging in those conversations and working towards those things as a people. So I shared enough of myself. Now I want to share a little bit of my dad. And my dad, he's a very humble person, and he wouldn't share this stuff about himself. So this is why I have to share about him. But you know, my dad has been doing so much work for our community for decades, right? And for him, you know, he had to do a lot of the work to figure out who he was as an indigenous person, as a Gabrielino person. For me, I was blessed to know who I was from literally a very young age. That's all I've known my whole life, right? Culturally, I've known that I was Native American, and then culturally, I've also known I was Gabrielino and indigenous to the LA County area. My dad had to rediscover a lot of that. He had bits and clues in which he'll share about how he rediscovered that past, but he had to really find that, and that took a lot of work, right? Being Native American back then wasn't a safe thing, wasn't something that was spoken outwardly. It was something that we may not have even known, you know, it was something that was suppressed. So he did a lot of work in revitalizing the culture in our family, did a lot of our genealogical work to understand who we are as a family and as Native people. But also, too, he went through a lot, and he endured a lot of those struggles that I didn't have to deal with in my own personal life. And I went through a number, but compared to my dad and the stories he'll share with you is, you know, it's something that's very much I really respect. So it leads to where he's at now. He's been a tribal singer and dancer with the Gabrielino San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, you know, for over close to 20-something plus years now. You know, he's seen our people go through major successes, but also major struggles. He's seen division. He's seen moments of unity. He's seen things that, you know, just have been really difficult to endure, right? And now he's doing work for the people on a level that, you know, should really be respected and be acknowledged. And he has spoken at numerous places, UCLA, and he has you know, worked with the Autry Museum of the American West, the Natural History Museum. He's worked with many different organizations. You know, he works real closely with the U.S. Forest Service and the different conservancies along the foothills. So He does a lot of work up here. He's a walking encyclopedia on Gabrielino culture, and you'll see that when you get to hear him. But that's my dad, so I'll let him now introduce himself.
Thank you. Miha none hapchigna susagna netoyane unat pesaga sun mahe. The whole of koi hane tata tota mahe. Capitan Montaña San Gabriel. Wishkoneha. I've introduced myself in our traditional language and way. I'm from the villages of Hapchigna and Asusagna. As my son mentioned, Asuksa is present-day Azusa. It means Asuk, grandmother, Sa of his. Ugna meaning village of the place of his grandmother. A lot of people aren't aware of that. Kukamugna, little water. So we have many place names that still exist. We introduce ourselves by our village because it shows our lineal connection to the areas we're from, our deep connections, not where we stay, but where we're from. And it's very meaningful because no one person is larger than the village. The village is a family. And that is throughout the entire village makeup or our family makeup, and then we carry that with us today. My people call me Bear Spirit Warrior because one, though I'm not large in stature, they say I have the strength of a bear. I'm a competitive strength athlete, but I also have that strength in the struggle and challenges we face. That spirit carries with me. And the warrior is because one, I am a warrior of our people. I'm a mahe. I'm a captain. I'm the captain of the San Gabriel Mountains, which is our word capitan, comes from the Spanish era, which means tomayar or kika, meaning chief. But we use the word leader rather than chief. It's a little big word that's overplayed. And as far as the warrior culture, that's a big part of myself. I am a veteran. There are 22 veterans in my family. 12 of them served during World War II. They were combat veterans. That I know of. Our research will still lead us to the other families of the Nunez to find out how deep that goes. Our warrior traditions in our family reach deep. We trace our family back to 1765 in the San Gabriel Wilderness, village of Hapchi or Hapchigna, Hapshivit also as it's known. Its location is kept secret because it is a sacred place, a very powerful place. It is a birthplace of chiefs. That's very proud for us to understand that, because as I speak to all of you tonight, you'll understand the meaning that that has to me to know that origin point of our family. Our village is at least 1,000 years old. Our people have been on this land for at least 10,000 years. The village site of Asusagna, carbon dated 9,000 years. We've been here a long time. So how do we connect into that past and bring that history to now and tell you where we've been and what we've been through? That's a challenge, especially in a short amount of time. And the best this will work tonight as I present this information to you is that you ask questions. And I'll give you the opportunities to do that. That is part of our tradition and way. And if you challenge me, that would be good. Challenge me with questions, because that's how I grow and learn as well. I'll give you the best answer I can. If I don't know it, I'll let you know. But there's a lot that I've been fortunate to be taught and have learned. I spend about an hour a day studying our culture, our people, our history. And I've been doing that for about 27 years. So back thousands of years ago, where were we? Where was our homeland? Well, it was fairly large. We lived upon the 4 lower islands, Channel Islands. We were a maritime people. A lot of people don't know that. We were one of 2 tribes that made plank canoes, and our trade routes extended 450 miles minimum to the east, north, and south, including our islands. If we were to go back pre-contact times, it would not have been uncommon to see more than 300 of our T-yachts on the ocean, traveling between the islands and the coast, and then north and south. Trade items, our necklaces. If you visit Arizona and visit the reservations that have museums, you'll see shell necklaces. And when we wear our traditional regalia, you'll see us wear those same necklaces. I always love the reaction when I walk into one of their cultural centers and they look at the necklace and then they look in their display case and it's like, yeah, our ancestors met with yours long ago. Imagine trade routes going all the way to New Mexico. It's pretty amazing, okay? So from approximately the Aliso Creek area out to about Corona, up the 15 freeway, across the San Gabriel Mountains, out to Santa Monica, was pretty much as we'd recognize as our homeland. As I speak to you tonight, I'm going to challenge some of the common thought of how far we were as far as the territory and how we integrated with others, how we had relationships with neighboring tribes. Because we're evolving our knowledge. What I've been teaching the last 20, 25 years, I'm being challenged now to look differently at things. Because the discoveries of the last 2 years are opening our minds in ways that we didn't know. Our own people, our own tribe, neighboring tribes are going to be challenged as to what they thought was connectivity. Yeah, there's a lot of history to uncover. We had more than 100 villages. Each village was autonomous. It had a chief, a tomayad, and a council of elders. And the chief was in charge of the daily goings-ons of the tribe, hunting, providing for food, communication with the other villages in the area. And the council of elders kept the chief sort of in check. It was a balance point. The moral and religious laws were kept by the Mahe, the warriors. They kept those. They were kind of like our policemen. We did not have standing armies. We had warriors in each individual village. They were highly skilled in combat, and we possessed some of the most advanced war clubs of any tribe in the Southern California area, Colorado River area, Northern Baja, or parts of Sonora. That's interesting considering we were not a militaristic type tribe. We were a trade people, primarily. And those weapons I have studied deeply and created them again, brought them back. Every known existing weapon, I've recreated it, brought it back into a functional state, and developed a pretty advanced usage of these weapons by the martial arts background I have, and been able to study them and understand what was the design intent or innate intelligence into those weapons. So I'm the only weapons maker, however, so I'm needing to probably teach that outward with our tribal members. And that's a challenge, as my son said, to do that. So, culturally, we interacted with many different tribes. And what I think is most fascinating now is to the extent that our village played in the pre-contact times. As I mentioned, we were a village of chiefs. And that's pretty cool, and also a good honor to find out, because I didn't know that, at the time that I was growing up and into this time now. I'm more aware of that. But what happened was they had a connectivity that would ensure somewhat peace by taking a chief and his wife and then making a journey up into the mountains so that the wife could give birth there. And that's what happened. So they would have birth of a future chief, or possible future chief, in the village. And that was important because it connected them not only to that village, which was the political center of the San Gabriel Mountains, but also for ceremony and other important things that needed to take place. So from there, members of Hapshivit would also go and marry into other villages. And when they did that, they became families. But they were still autonomous. But that kept one village from deciding it was going to become more powerful than another and take it over. In some cases, we had provincial chiefs, like Pascual from Jajamugna, which is this area, all the way out into the Arroyo Seco. That village numbered nearly 1,000. It was huge. And he would oversee the daily goings-on and ceremonies and things of villages near him. Mateo Huyabit, which is present-day Almonte. Same thing. Mateo oversaw 3 or 4 villages. So what era are we talking about? What time period? Well, these things, this way of life was taking place probably until about the early 1800s. Our first contact with the Spanish, or the first colonizer to come, was occurring possibly in the 1400s. That is ongoing research. Interesting century, right? You wouldn't think that. It seems really, really early back. But very possible. In the 1500s, the Spanish were making forays across California by ocean. They came to the islands at that time, and they recorded what they saw and their interactions. But it wouldn't be until the 1760s, really, that the Spanish did come. And they came by way of Yuma into California, and the missionization began. And why did that happen? Well, from what I learned in school, missionization was this wonderful thing that was brought here to teach our people religion, to save us from the paganism and ways. Well, there was some truth to that to some extent, at least in the eyes of the Catholic missionaries that came. But the real reason they needed us was because they had already fought many wars in the Americas. And they had learned that it was much easier to keep the native population, but create them in a different image, one that was much like theirs. Then you could have a large workforce. And that workforce was to support the presidios. And that was the military arm of the Spanish. And why did they need that? Because the British and Russians were in the area. And there was competition for resources and land. But that didn't go so well. Our people resisted from the very get-go. We had already heard about the Spanish for a couple hundred years. We knew that what they had done down south with the Mexica and the Triple Alliance. And they had come into contact with many, many tribes. Many different unions were created, and alliances between the Spanish and actual tribes. So our people were well aware. But again, we weren't a militaristic type people. So when they did come, they had a couple hundred years of fighting wars on this land, and we were used to single combat or small combat in small groups. So our people also had another problem, well, two problems. One, we were village-based. We didn't have castles. We didn't have gunpowder, cannons, firearms, large dogs. And in addition to that, we did not have a landscape that either protected us, well, we did have some, and you're familiar with these mountains. But in addition, no allies or enemies of the Spanish at that time. So it became a very difficult period. The Spanish established the first mission down Whittier Way off the Rio Hondo. That mission suffered greatly by attacks from the local villages, but also by flood, fire, and earthquake. To the point that the Spanish said, well, this is not going to work for us. So they went to present-day San Gabriel, and they built the first mission there. And their expansion was by rings. So if you were to look at Chester King's work on the village of Habshavit, which is our village, then it would explain in there how that took place, how they expanded in rings. And the idea was to hopefully welcome in a village by getting to know the chief. And by doing that with that Tomoyari, you could bring the people in and have some kind of cordial relations. And perhaps then that they would accept Catholicism, accept Spanish language, and the European model for employment, which was being blacksmith and raising cattle and goats and those types of things. But each village had its own, view of how they were going to continue, whether they were going to continue on their own or they were going to join the Spanish. And there was a lot of conflict. This conflict would happen from the 1770s into the early 1820s. And I'm moving quite quickly here, but in 1785, Toy Perina led the first revolt, and she was the first native woman to lead a revolt against the Spanish out of our village of Habshavit in the San Gabriel Mountains. And that was significant because it was the first time a large organized revolt to push the Spanish out occurred. Unfortunately for the warriors of Toy Perina's war party, which included over 8 villages, they met up with resistance from the Spanish Guard. One of them was Jose Marie Verdugo. He was in charge of the military arm of San Gabriel Mission. And you've heard of the Verdugo Mountains, correct? Yeah. Well, Mariano de la Luz Verdugo is his brother, and that's one of our grandfathers. And I'll explain how that happens. Okay? So that would be the first of about 7 revolts. Okay? It was unsuccessful because the neophytes, those were missionized Indians, overheard a conversation and leaked that to the Spanish, and they were waiting. Okay? And Toy Perina was tried and exiled, and many of the other participants, the captains, were given some severe punishments and were put back into the enslavement. So to what extent was that enslavement of the mission in that time? If you were to go to San Gabriel Mission today and we were to take a walk, just around the mission grounds and around the area. 6,000 of our people are underneath the parking lots, the stores, restaurants, school, and we are also the mortar for the walls. 6,000. And they died through disease, the work. I mean, there was different time periods when the priests believed that the natives should suffer, and they gave them wool clothing that they had to wear in the summer. Imagine that, how wool feels, and working. They were deprived of their native diet. They weren't used to the foods. So dysentery and other diseases were quite common. They were worked from the bell of the early morning till the late evening. This type of routine was brutal, and of course it led to many rebellions. And it was challenged, that authority was challenged. But again, our people died rather quickly, and the mass graves were created. They tried to escape back to their villages. Sometimes the village would still be in existence, other times it wouldn't, so they would not have a place to go. They'd be rounded up. Once you were baptized into the mission, you became mission property or church property, and you were entered into the books. So we know during World War II that also happened to the Jews, as if they were marked, right? Well, one of the reasons why we know so much today is because we go into the mission records and we find our numbers. So every Indian in the past has a number in the books. So there's a number for your baptism, marriage, for your death, and many other things also, if you were a witness or a godparent. You know. So how many of you are aware of all that? Just a few, huh? So I want to take a pause. Would you guys like to ask me some questions now? Because I know I've thrown a lot of history and I've gone rather quickly. But
you folks, do you have Thanksgiving hippies for large ceremony?
well, yeah, actually, yes. And I'll answer that into two parts to it. As far as a sweat was concerned. So if I go back to the earliest time period in our creation, the Supreme One, or the Creator, Quawad, sent the first captain, Wewut, to teach the people how they should live. This is at the time didn't know how they should live. And one of those ways was bathing. So rising early in the morning to sweat, to sauna. So for many tribes, that's like a religious experience or spiritual. Of our people, it was like a hygiene one. So you'd rise in the morning and you would bathe in sauna and then go into the cold water to rinse. And the other part of it, yes, there were ceremonies that the medicine people would conduct for various purposes. So, and about the water, so I'll lead into it this way. I work for Azusa Unified School District, 29 years now. I work in the maintenance department. One of my cousins works at one of the schools, and I was taking a break, and she was there, and I started talking to her a little bit about the culture and history. And as we finished up, I asked her, I said, cousin, I want to ask you a question. When you were growing up, did your father or grandfather or anyone ever introduce you to cold water as some kind of a thing, a ritual? She starts laughing. I said, what about washing your face? Were you ever told about washing your face? She goes, oh my gosh, my dad, all the time. Make sure you wash your face at the very least and always rinse with cold water. Well, whenever I went to see my grandfather, which was often because he was the biggest influence and had me in the mountains, he would always say, did you wash your face? He'd tell my mom, did he wash his face? Well, you want to know what? That is going back to what I told you. I traced that back in my family 200 years. And that is part of the original ways, pre-contact, that survived. In addition to that, there was a warrior aspect of it, which involved cold water. So now I can tell you a little bit about myself growing up. My culture is the mountains. I learned to walk at Follows Camp, East Fork. And I learned to fish there, I learned to hunt, I learned to track, and the tracking came from one uncle in particular who was a World War II sniper. And so what I thought was a game of hide and go seek as a kid No, I was being taught a lot of things that I wouldn't know till later in my life, exactly what he was showing me. And the water was something that was introduced in a way where I might, go out into the cold water to retrieve a fishing hook. And this could be in February. To washing things, to tying fish lines. And then it eventually went to just getting out in the water. Now my uncle, my mother's twin, was a bear of a man. He was 6 feet tall and about 270 pounds. Played college football. He was a surfer too. And he used to come out in February and come to the house and say, "Come on, let's go surfing. Go ask your mom." I go, "It's raining outside." He goes, "You're going to get wet anyway." I'm like, "Okay." I go, "It's cold." He goes, "Don't worry about it. I got a plan." And his plan was we would paddle out into the cold water until we couldn't lift our arms anymore. And he warned me about that. He said, "At some point you're going to be so numb you can't lift your arms." He says, "When that happens, let me know. If you can't wave at me, just yell at me." I go, "Okay." I'll be shivering. And he goes, "We'll go in." And I go, "Oh, great. Now we're going to go out there and do this, and then we're going to come in." Yeah, come in to do jumping jacks, wind sprints, and push-ups. And then when I got warm, he goes, "You warm enough now?" I go, "Yeah, let's go back out." Does this sound something familiar today that you might see down around Coronado? Yeah, that was Mahe training. That was warrior training. And to teach you, to toughen you up. One thing my grandfather always told me when I was growing up, he says, "Every now and then I want you to take a cold shower." I said, "Why is that, Grandpa?" He goes, "To remind you how good you got it. How much better you had than I had. And it's good for you anyway. It's good for your health." Well, my grandfather had an 8th grade education, and he, was far removed from this era where people take ice baths as athletes. But yeah, they knew. This went way back, and it had a lot to do with circulation and toughening the body. So these are some of the cultural things that I was given that would strengthen me and give me some fond memories. So to answer your question, you can see how that relates back. And that kind of connectivity is important to me because that connects me to the past, and it gives me those roots or those seeds, right? So that I can navigate now and understand now and what I teach to our tribal members and to other tribes and to those even that are not part of our tribe that are interested, like you all are here today. You showed up, and we're very thankful for that. So we have that connectivity, so you can see how my connection is to the mountains. How many of you have been to the bridge to nowhere? Awesome. Some of you have. I've made that hike over 300 times, and I made that hike pre-bungee jumping. That's when it was a wilderness still. There were remnants of the road from the washout of 38, the 100-year storm. But there were still things laying around that you could see that, workers had been there at that time. Today, it's a pretty well-established trail, but I remember you would lose your way on the way up. Lose your way meaning not get lost, but have trouble navigating how to get there, So that's just one area. But I've walked all over these mountains, most of it alone, deep into some places people probably haven't been since my ancestors, and maybe my ancestors didn't even go there. Because they had to have a reason, right? We didn't just walk all over the mountains just to do it. Today we love to climb peaks. My ancestors said, "Well, is there a resource up there? Is there a reason? Are we doing a ceremony?" Or else they probably would have just been, unless they were out and about. Okay? So not everything is always too complicated with us, We went to certain places because we had a reason for being there, not just to walk there. So what about these San Gabriel Mountains? And if I shift that way. And you had a question before I get going.
Well, it's just kind of how difficult it must have been. The records of the missions, how many different given names, how much was changed from the identity of who's entering that system, and how do you go back further from that?
Okay. That's good question. One of the challenges we find when we go into the records, the early California project, Huntington Library, is that mass baptisms were done. Fortunately for the Chumash, who are northwest, their native names were entered at the time that they were baptized. For our people, not so much. So on a particular day, if Adriano was going to be the name of the day, they might baptize 30 men with the same name. So that could be very challenging to try and trace yourself back to one of the Adrianos. and the villages are listed, and that's what gives us that advantage. Yes.
Can you say something about the history about the Illinois Trail?
Yeah, okay, so the trail itself is part of a network that left the Arcadia area, but also could be entered through Tahugna. And that relates to the Silver Moccasin Trail. And that trail is a trade route that goes from the San Gabriel Valley to present-day Wrightwood, and was to connect with the high desert. It's a series of rim traveling routes. And so, let me back up a little bit before I get more into that. So my thing has always been, how did my family and ancestors navigate these mountains? Because they're dense. Get off trail and you know that's rough country. Steep, and there's things out there that can give you problems too, like poison oak and rattlesnakes and all kinds of other issues that could happen. Well, the way we did it is we traveled along the rims, the spines. And so throughout these mountains, there are places where you can still see the charcoal pits, the fire pits. So that is just one part of that. Hahamugna is a high country site, campsite. We only had really two villages in the San Gabriel Mountains, Habshavit and Muskopiabit, which is in the Cajon Pass. Have you been through the Cajon Pass on the 15C McDonald's?
Yes.
Very close to there is Muskopiabit. And what's that?
The left is to the right.
As you are traveling north on the 15 freeway, before you get to the way station, on the left on the southbound, there's another way station that's not used often. Below that area there was the village. Yeah.
At what point in history did you find that you went from being Indio, and according to mission records, to white? And what does it say on birth certificates now? And how are you trying to change that to reclaim your identity?
Okay. That happens in the American period, for the most part. That happens and starts to be reoccurring 1870s. Yeah, at least I can see that in my own family when I trace into that era. There wasn't a designation necessarily for Indian, and that was a very difficult thing to be labeled. And to give you an idea, see, the challenge is that when we're teaching our culture, and that's a very, very important question, is how do I not depress the hell out of you from the beginning, or bring something that's going to really challenge your view of what happened here, and then get to something different? Well, those were tough periods of time. So to give you an idea without delving too deeply into the past and certain time periods, in the early 1900s, slightly before and during the time of the birth of my grandfather, what was common if you were an Indian living here is powerful business owners, landowners would distribute alcohol to our people, get them drunk out of their mind on a Friday, and on Sunday would send out the local police to round them all up. Monday, brought before the magistrate, they would be sentenced for their drunkenness in public and then auctioned off to those very same businesses that gave them the alcohol. Okay, so we had already gone through slavery in the 1700s, early 1800s, and then to face this in the early 1900s. Our people were still being hung for the slightest grievance. If you looked at a woman not of your race and she felt uncomfortable, a story could be had. There's a tree that still exists in Yagna in LA where our people were hung. Now, imagine this. This is at a time period of my grandfather being born and his brothers and his cousins. And just 20 years later, they were all fighting for this country. You know, I know how hard that one is to explain to people, to young natives that come to me and want to know about that. Because, see, we have these warrior traditions, and that includes the military service, right? So there's certain respect that I'm going to give my grandfather's generation in relation to that service. And any veterans will know that there are certain respects that we have. But then again, look what we'd already been through. I didn't even talk about the Russians. How many of you knew the Russians were here? Yeah, the Russians came to our islands. They came for two reasons. One, to hunt, to get pelts, sea otter pelts, and to procure women. Island of the Blue Dolphin. Anybody heard of that book? Beginning of the book, there's a scene where, well, it's not a scene, but you can imagine in your mind, it talks about an exchange, a battle taking place. That's what was happening. So I'm going to tell you one war story. The Russians came, and they were primarily, maritime hunters. And they needed a force arm of those expeditions, so they brought the Aleuts that were from the islands off Alaska. And they came to do the hunting, but also too, they came to take the women. And after this going on for quite some time, a couple of decades, they landed on San Nicolas Island. And they were well aware, the islanders, what was going to happen. There were several ships, and they knew what was going to happen. They had nowhere to go. We couldn't outrun them in our T-yachts, even though they could travel at maybe up to 13 knots. But they knew what was going to happen. The men put up a fight. One of them, Black Hawk, who ended up dying in where there's a park in San Pedro below Fort MacArthur, where the Air Force Base is in that area. He actually died there. He received a head injury in this battle. And they fought best they could, but they were overtook. The women submitted to the Russian men and the Aleut warriors. But they also got them drunk out of their mind. And later that night, they crept into their camps and onto their ships. And they turned their skulls into eggshells and cut their throats. Shortly after that, the remaining were brought back here to the coast and then brought into the missions. So that's one of the things that was occurring with the Russians. So we had a Russian interaction, Spanish interaction. And perhaps the worst period of time was the Mexican period. So today you'll often hear, well, this was Mexico. Well, that was contested by every tribe in the Southwest. When the Mexicans came, the first thing that they did, well, they were supposed to turn the mission over, property and lands over to our people. That was in their constitution. It's not what they did. They divvied up the land and gave it to their rich friends. And then Governor Alvarado ordered the extermination policy. That was funded by Mexico City, their soldiers to sack every existing Indian village in the area and eliminate them. So that's what happened. The Mexican period, after thousands of our people died, our pre-contact population was probably 25,000. And that figure comes off of the mission rolls and records saying how many were in each village. A lot of our people would teach was about 5,000 of us. No, our village is probably average at about 200. 100 villages, you get up to that number, okay? So we're now down in the thousands, and then the Mexican government arrives, and during their 20-some years, really put it to us. There are more of our people living in other parts of California than in our homeland at that time. And by the time the 1850s, 60s, 70s come, our people are dispersed and in hiding. Our culture is hiding. And maybe my son can tell the story of how we hid the culture, the story Chief tells. So our people now are holding council in private, and they're hiding out, and everybody's coming here. California was attractive, and people came. But see, that's 3 time periods, right? And now you're looking at 3 different waves of colonization that probably wasn't taught. Because what we'll hear is, well, when the Americans came. Well, when the Americans came here to our homeland, we had already been suffering through waves of colonizations for decades. So when they come, we had brief skirmishes, but not large-scale warfare. Our brothers and sisters to the north, they had a lot of problems. Gold, number 1. Trade. So they had outright wars with American troops. Okay? We didn't have that because we had already faced the Spanish, the Russians, and the Mexicans, and we were depleted and dispersed. However, a lot of our people joined in with other tribes and fought with them. So that's a lot of history in a short period of time for us to endure. It's amazing today, you hear my son speak the language, that's massive, that introduction. In 1 generation, we changed that. Going back to what you were talking about. Why is it hard for our people to rediscover their identity? So that's difficult because when you get into the records, you're going to see name changes. You're going to see a birth certificate that may say you were white. Well, that at the time that was true. There were also terms in those records like octoroon, quadroon. Those are to indicate how much sub-Saharan African blood you had. So the caste system, or the way the Spanish did things, is everyone, no matter what you were mixed with, got recorded. Okay? So that was recorded. So you could have been 7/8 native, 1/8 sub-Saharan black African, and now you were an octoroon. So how do you trace that back? Also, the challenges they faced before that in the mission records is like this. And I know this because this happened in a branch of my family. So they didn't bring women with them, not at first. So once colonization began, they, like anyone else, they're going to look for a partner. And most of that was forced. But if you were only half Spanish, then you couldn't be in the military or you couldn't hold good jobs. So what that Spaniard would do is pay the padres, the recorders, to send back the record that they're a razón, meaning 100% pure. But that only went for the boys. The girls were mestiza, coyote. They had names for them, depending on what degree of Indian blood you had and what you were mixed with. So women to the Spanish were for pleasure, childbirthing, and taking care of the house. That was what they were for. Those are the ways it was, you know. So imagine trying to trace back now. So we got to get through the American records. Then we got to get into the Mexican period. Then you need to get into the Spanish period to find out who your villages are. 25 years of research. It can. It's not precise enough to put us in a geographic location, but it's getting close. Yeah, I mean, Ancestry.com does have like a Southern California description, you know. It's pretty accurate, but it's just not that far. But then you have to understand, because I haven't even got into how do you name us, our tribe. So today you'll hear names like Tongva, Kish, Kumivet, Kuvimatang. These are all different names. Boy, I could spend a lot of time trying to explain this part. But when the San Gabriel Mission was established, they brought in natives from other tribes too. So if you trace yourself back to the San Gabriel Mission, you're technically a Gabrieleno, because your Indian ancestors were in the mission. But that doesn't tell you which tribe. In the 1920s, a lot of our people were able to register with the BIA as Gabrielenos, but it didn't indicate specifically your origin or family's origin point. So today we have those that are BIA registered, and then we have those that are mission records. The mission records are more accurate. It took a long time for me to get to 1765. Yeah.
What about residential schools? Were there residential schools around here?
Yeah, there was Sherman Indian School.
So
Yeah.
is that a good place?
That's a good place for records too, yeah. Because I know tribal members that have been able to go and go back pretty deep into when the school was established, and their tribal affiliation was sometimes noted. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I just want to thank you for sharing your story and letting us learn from you. And it was amazing to watch your son just being as you were talking and sharing. One of the things I was wondering about, because you mentioned that you study every day.
Mm-hmm.
So what are you reading and studying, and who documented it, and how do I get access?
Okay.
Anybody?
The works of Chester King are where I'm at right now, because he did a nearly 50-page report on our village, and he was hired by the U.S. Forest Service to do that report because they needed to have a more accurate idea of what was going on in a certain area of the mountains. And in addition to that, I delve heavily into many reports that were prepared for developments, either housing developments or specific businesses, where they had to do an environmental report, but they also do have to do a cultural report. And some of those can be up to 700 pages. So what I'm studying now and what I think is groundbreaking is that where are tribal boundaries? Man, this is complicated because today you have tribal governments, which sits a tribal chair and a tribal council that are now overseeing a membership, but that doesn't fit tribally how we were. We were autonomous villages. So what I'm doing is matrilineal connectivity. So I'm going back to find out who was mixing with who. And since Chester King did that work really well, he went into the mission records and he says, oh, look at, this is interesting. Asusagna had this connection with Windingna. Interesting. Oh, they had one with Kukumugna. Kupiabit was over here with Komikrabit. All these villages. And then he built these charts. Why are things changing? Well, my village had relations with 18 other villages. And as far away as Barstow. Okay? I'm only going to take this conversation so far because this challenges a lot of the norms today of what our tribes in this area, and some of it has to be retained within our own, as we try and understand this. But it was really simple before. Fernandeños, Ahashiman, Kauia, Luceños, Serranos, Katinamuk, etc. It's more complicated than that. We're really getting deep into things now because we are learning all the time and we're challenging ourselves to grow. So when I look at that, as I explained earlier, that's where that connectivity is happening. So that doesn't mean a whole village was, going over and having a good time with, another village and people were meeting each other and then we'll just get married. This was happening at the chief level. This is the royal lines. Yes?
Was your language close to the Chumash, and you guys have a written language, either something else?
Yeah, the Chumash language is different. The Holcomb language, we're of the Takik line. And they are different. They are very different. And the Chumash language is older and deeper in its development, and the Chumash go back twice as far as we do as far as carbon dating. Yeah. So whenever we arrived, and that's a challenge because some people of our people would say we originated here, but we all have origin points if we go back far enough that things moved, people moved. Yeah. Yes. Get to you next.
I've heard that there's no actual Tongva tribe. That was actually a term that was created by a professor that was doing research. How do you feel about the use of the term Tongva?
Okay. Well, I've delved heavy into that, and I've done that several ways. One, who's living now that was using the name, and how far beyond them can I get? Also, what was recorded. So, we introduced ourselves by our village. That's our stance. Now, as far as whether we're Gabrielenos and where we fall into these names, we had Indian ancestors in the mission, so we are Gabrieleno. And as far as the name Tongva, well, I've researched that heavy, and I can say that I've spoken to existing families today and researchers, and I cannot trace the name before the early 1900s. I have a good idea how it came to be, but I'll take a little step back from going fully into what I have researched, just that I think the name is approximately in use since the 90s, with some mention in the early 1900s, but not in its current use name. Okay? Well, I reserve the right as a people to identify ourselves how we wish, and I think I have a good understanding how that name came to be, and it was taken from a variety of different sources. The name Quiche, Horatio Hale recorded the name back into the middle 1800s. That is our name for house. So I will get controversial with this one. Our people were very, very smart. They were very deep in culture. They were very deep in our religion and our ways. We were more creative than saying we are the people of the willow house, because we're not the only ones that had willow houses. Also, we didn't build willow houses on the islands. Okay? And my people in the mountains didn't build them. They wouldn't have stood up into the winters. So that's how I feel about that. I would say that the way I teach it is know your villages. If you don't know them, well, let's hear your oral history. If it looks solid, we go forward and you learn. but you continue to trace. You continue to push. We have to do that. We have to do that culturally, but we have to do that as a matter of legitimacy. You know? Yeah.
When you're doing the research or when you're listening back to what your grandfather taught you, where do you decide to follow that traditional knowledge, whether it be a story or ecological knowledge? How do you decide what to follow?
Culturally?
Culturally, spiritually?
Yeah.
Because we all have those stories that are in our family. How do you decide which one is worth following and which one is probably just grandpa talking?
Yeah. Well, some of the teachings of my family can be verified by written records that were predating, you know, the American period or Mexican period, things that were written down. But to more deeply answer that, I say often, we are the mountains and the mountains are us. The reason I say that is because our DNA is in the mountains. I have 3 relatives buried in our village that I know of through mission records. But my culture is the mountains. It always has been. So I connect more with it than I do the coast or the islands or the maritime part of us. I surfed, but never kayaked or built boats to go out there. I never had the urge to do that. And I live in Wrightwood right now, by the way. I was born in San Gabriel, right next to the mission. I didn't explain that. I was born at that hospital. That's where I was born, right next to the mission. And I was raised in Azusa. My family's been there since 1886. And we trace back in the mountains to 8 generations from my son. 3 generations are alive. Back to Hapshavit, 1765, 1767, the birth of my 4 times great-grandparents. And my 3 times great-grandfather was born there too. And they moved about. So our culture has always been the mountains. And so that's what I say, my culture is the mountains. And those stories represent a small percentage of what I have now, because I've been taught culture since the 90s. Actually, one of my biggest influences was Miss Maggie Neblis, who was in El Vitre, who was Gabrielino. She lived across the street from me as I was growing up. She used to watch me, babysit me. She always talked about things. I didn't know what that would mean till later, you know. So I had to take what was obvious. If I showed you pictures of my grandfather and the brothers and sisters of my mom, which I may be able to do, yeah, you knew Native. You could see it. And I used to question. They called me the hammer. And they said I talk too much. And I do. I talk a lot. But so I had to dig a lot, and I had to bring out like identification. I can tell you something about the name. My family referred to themselves as Indios de los Angeles, or LA Indians. That's one of the oldest terms, well, to have a geographic location. And that goes back in our family to the 1800s, like 1850s. Yeah, that was from my great-great-grandfather. So the culture is now grown to where I learned from Elder Julia Bogany, Chief Anthony Morales, the one they called the Beaver. Everybody had cool names, you know. But I've learned from so many that the list would be long and well-respected. And to learn songs and stories, and then those just interweave with who I am. But our culture is the mountains. You go into the mountains with me, and you'll know. When we walk, I'll tell you stories. I'll point things out. Who's heard of Sedley Peck? Oh man, you got to look him up. Okay, because he was not native, but he was living in El Doradoville, Follows Camp, that area in the East Fork, and he was a good friend of my grandfather. Okay, and Sedley, in one of his videos where he's interviewed, and there's a bunch of them, he refers to the guardians of the mountains. He thought he identified them as being Yaqui, but I think that's because they refer to us as Yudo-Aztecans, and they tended to think that way. The guardians he spoke about were our people, and I was able to understand that because the places that he said these guardians were, I know now to be recorded, documented archaeological sites of specific purpose. So he was partly right. Yeah. But we've worked that out. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the role, ancestral role of stewardship of the land?
Yes. Okay, so first let me tell you about two of our most important tenets, and those were number one, reciprocity. Number one, reciprocity, one of our most important tenets, things. So that goes back to the chiefs, the Tomiyar. They would receive and take care of guests, okay, and want to establish relations. The next was the respect and not to trespass on lineal hunting, gathering, burial, ceremonial, etc. grounds. Okay, so that meant that each village was a steward of its area, and they had to have balance. So today we're known for the acorn. That's very important. We have a lot of songs about the acorn. We have dances about the acorn. But the acorn was famine food. Famine food. The acorn is something that you can put into a granary and you can have into the deep season where it was more difficult to get out. Okay, so was it important? Could it be made into many things like bread and you know, porridge and different things? Yeah, absolutely. But it was something that you could guarantee yourself a food source that you didn't have to go too far. That's why it was so important to go to the oak trees and collect the acorns. But we liked to hunt, and it was plentiful. So plant resources were more or less on the way. As you went somewhere, then you knew what to eat. And we ate everything from insects to, you know, plants, berries, different things. But hunting was the biggest thing. Whether it walked or swam, you know, there weren't a lot of taboos. So the stewardship of the land, they were very specific about how they interacted. Everything had to have a time in the cycle and the ceremonies that went with it and their rituals and things. The land dominated, so it wasn't so much of a care that they needed to specifically care for the land. But I can tell you about our fire burning practices. We did not light fires in the mountains. That's a challenge today because we have northern tribes that have developed their own ways to manage today that are rooted in some things, but in our mountains, look, we had 2 villages up there, okay? Today when there's, you know that we just had a fire, we lost 120,000 acres, burned from San Gabriel Valley to the high desert. We had tankers dropping on that. We had big bulldozers. They couldn't stop it. We wouldn't have done it either. Where did we have fires? Down here in the valley, on the islands. And why? Why did they do that? Well, they did it to clear areas to create a village. That could be one reason. Another reason would be to stimulate the land. They would burn an area, clear out old growth, and then that would propagate new growth because the plants had evolved that way. But they also knew you couldn't do that too often because then you challenged the land to reproduce what was already on the land. So if we were to go into the San Gabriel Mountains today, there are places we could go and you could find out it's looking a little bit like a desert with grass. And the reason is because the fires are occurring so often, you can't grow back everything. Okay? And the springs get affected, something simple like that. You know, you have burned land, you have heavy rain, you have wash, mud, buries a spring. That's a habitat area now that's gone. So the animals are going to need to go somewhere else. You know, that's why you'll find more of them and more animals now in Crystal Lake, because that was the line, that ridge, the slip ridge. So that's how I can kind of best explain it. They were well aware that they had to balance their resources, you know, not over. So that's why we tended to spread out and keep in small clusters. And then they had an area, and then it would help protect the area from being overhunted. Yes?
Kind of related to what we were just talking about, but I've always been interested in, I wonder if you could tell me about, if you know anything about the relationship that your ancestors had with grizzly bears, because the grizzly bears are kind of a, you know.
Yeah, the grizzly bear, amongst the other challenges, was one of the main reasons why we weren't so. Oh, look at that! I magnified that when I crossed my arms. Sorry. The grizzly bear was a you know, an apex predator and definitely made it challenging. You know, so the bear was also revered like as an ancestor or a relation. We had two associations. One was the stones, rock, tota, and then the bear, because the bear would show mannerisms like a human by standing upright, and so we created stories about these powerful bears, and of course then at night you could probably create some even better stories of the fear of a grizzly bear. So the stories rooted into the religion and spirituality, but also too in just everyday lessons on how you could be taught about what could happen to you if you go out at night with the bear, a grizzly bear. And so these bears are imported that we have now, so they're migrant bears that were established here, and they're nowhere nearly as aggressive as the grizzly bear would have been. And there are stories about them having to go out and hunt these bears sometimes because they cause a lot of havoc. I'm kind of still trying to process how my family lived up in Hopshavit, because I live in Wrightwood and I just went through that blizzard. Yeah, it was rough. I can't imagine what it would have been like if they got hit by a blizzard back then. But yeah, that's why it was better to live down here. It was good, Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about land acknowledgement,
Mhm.
where people meet and acknowledge the traditional lands of peoples who were originally here.
Mhm.
And the question is, how would you name them for this area?
Name someone who's doing the land acknowledgement, like the person that's bringing the land acknowledgement. Is that what you mean, or?
Yeah, like for instance, a meeting like this.
Oh, okay. What do you think? Because this is a big topic for us. I just did a land acknowledgement at a powwow. And for me, I'm about relationships. So hopefully, I have a pretty good facial memory. Names, I'm tough, but I might see you on the trail sometime. I want to build relationships. So when I'm brought to do a land acknowledgement, it's usually me trying to leave a little bit of culture, a little bit of connectivity, and hoping that we spark something long term. In this case, we're here to drop a lot of history and culture. It's a little different. So I'll let my son kind of lead into that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll let my dad catch his breath and drink some water. He probably needs that. So we're a little parched at this point. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, I think a land acknowledgement, right, is a great entry place to have these type of discussions. And, foster that type of thinking that, well, one, the people who are indigenous here are still here, right? And there's a history to these lands. So at the most basic level, a land acknowledgement is important, right? But I think it has to go beyond just like at every function there's an acknowledgement of the people. It has to be something more substantive than that, right? So regarding the name, of how you go about recognizing the people, well, one, LA County is a huge swath of land. So if you look at the geographic boundaries of LA County, well, encompassing inside of it is Chumash lands, or very close boundaries. There's Serrano, right? There's Fernandino, right? And there's Gabrielino, right? The main four, basically. Now, that doesn't mean all four of those were in the exact same place within all of LA County. No, we had boundary lines. It may not have been a border per se, right? Direct fence, but they were lines. And like my dad said, one of the most important tenets of our people was respecting those, those areas where we gathered, where we had ceremony, right? So it was really important to our people, right? So when we're looking at, like, let's say the city of Los Angeles, right? That's Yagna. So that would be in Gabrielino territory or lands, or what my dad said in regards to the name, which is more commonly known as Tongva, right? So this is where, I think we can leave it up to our community is still trying to figure out 100% what that looks like, but that's understandable because we are figuring things out as we learn more about our people. So you cannot expect us to have all the answers of exactly what we called ourselves, right? And, parts of history that we're still trying to uncover. So I would say, regarding the people who occupied the San Gabriel Valley, the city of Los Angeles, right? Out towards Seal Beach, those areas, that would be the Gabrielino people. The Gabrielino people is with the name that we'll often use. We choose to use that name. Or, if you would like, you can use Tongva too, right? But that's would be the more appropriate acknowledgement for the people who are here, right? But like my dad said, it goes beyond that because in regards to our villages, we're very distinct. Our language was completely different from the Chumash. So we knew a Chumash village from a Gabrielino or Tongva village because just the way it ended and the end of the village name denoted that it was very unique to our own language itself, right? We didn't have a written language, but orally, right, there was a lot of distinctions specifically. So Asusagna, the NGA, right, Ugna, the Yagna, NGA again, right, which denotes village or place, right? Cucamonga, which is Ranch Cucamonga, NGA, again, denoting place or village. So you see this from even where the Tahugna area is in what is presently called today, right? The GNA again, right? Cahuenga, right? GNA again. So Topanga, GNA again. A lot of these names have been carried over to today. So again, those are pretty good indicators that that would be Gabrielino, or if you'd like to call it Tongva, village or places. So yeah, they're very distinct, and but we also too, we understand that there's other tribes and other cultures of indigenous people that were very closely near us that are also inside the LA County geographical boundary line. So yeah, that would be Ferdinand Daniel Serrano, and then us as Gabrielinos and the Chumash too.
Yeah, we're complicated. I mean, right now. And we have to find that common ground. I don't fuss over the name too much because I'll just come with my villages and say this is who I am, and that kind of, you know, puts an exclamation point on it. But I wouldn't say that any of the names are incorrect. It's just simply, you know, what's most accepted, you know, and but it is complicated.
But I can see
Yeah.
the day.
Mhm.
We moved here from British Columbia, and the university, for instance, that we were at, all meetings begin with an acknowledgement of the land. And there are multiple tribes, and bands up there in that area. So, in fact, now people are renaming places
Yeah.
for their original names. And it just seems to me that as people begin to acknowledge the past of this area, that those things could happen and should. So that's why I was asking.
I appreciate that, and that's really key, right? You know, we hope that that's what's coming, and it is happening. But at the same time, too, we acknowledge that we want things to be more than just a land acknowledgement, right? So we always say, how do we go beyond a land acknowledgement, right? So when we have a connection with the mountains and the Sangre Mountains in particular, the National Forest, how can we support and work with the forestry on land management, right? How can we be part of these larger conversations on fire suppression, right? And because again, we did not do controlled burns in the mountains. So again, anything that's coming down here was not for this type of environmental climate, ecological climate, right? So it's good to be a part of these conversations. We understand the landscape really well, and we do work up there. You know, my dad didn't talk about the work that he does, but you know, a lot of the work he did transferred over to me, right? And we still are up there doing the work, right? And we're up there facilitating these conversations on how do we, which I mentioned earlier, how do we have sustainable recreation, right? How do we have better educational programs, right? But not just how do we have it, let's actually create a plan. And let's create a plan that's sustainable and fundable. And so the funds just don't die off because of a lawsuit that happens or something, right? So, you know, we try to do our best to help, you know, one, establish those relationships, which we really believe in. And also, two, we try to work towards these actual plans that can be implemented in the forest, right? Which can be difficult for us as a people because we're not federally recognized. We're only state recognized, right? And that's a big thing, but it's not federal recognition. So when you become federally recognized, the whole dynamic of a tribe to government relationship completely changes, right? And if we were federally recognized, well, it'd be easy for us to work with the U.S. Forest Service. We wouldn't have to do years of relationship building and inviting them to our spaces and finding, hopefully, we find the right people, right? Because it's not everybody.
We're third generation working with the forestry.
Right.
3 generations.
So it would be a lot easier if we were federally recognized. So we're working towards that, right? But yeah.
Relationships can transcend that.
Exactly.
Yeah, you had a question?
Yes, back to the comment about names, place names. I work with expeditions in Asia and Europe recording old names, and I know how important it is to preserve those names, because place names, because they can show who lived there, when, how they moved, how they related. And one thing that I wish happened in New World is actually preserving more traditional names instead of naming something after some colonizer who just mapped some peak and was named after him.
Yeah.
So I can imagine there's records and memories of the names, the way indigenous people called locations. And have you considered maybe starting, at least for some of the locations, some process with whoever is like the city of LA or the forest, like returning the traditional names instead of...
It's a very slow process, but it is happening. And in many places where you go to an arboretum or a land area that's managed, you'll start to see our names on placards of, because one of the things you have to understand about, our people here on this land is that we were the first people here, so we were the first to name everything. So there's value in that. And it's about relationship, because I know that challenges a lot of ways of thinking. Well, what are you changing? Well, we've been through a lot of change. But remember also when I said that there were 22 veterans in my family? So we've also contributed. So when we ask for things, it's really not too much, because we've been here on a lot of levels to support where this country is right now, especially this area. Okay. Yeah, that's been something that I really thought about, and I think it's really, my direction is more focused. I tend to stay in my lane today. My strength is the mountains. And by the way, I didn't tell you how I started with the kind of the activism. I was in 4th grade when that started for me, because my teachers, well, in the 70s, they taught a little bit different. So they said, well, you guys need to learn how to write letters. So what do you want to tell local politicians? So guess what I wanted to tell them? Why is there graffiti in my mountains? And I was saying my mountains without knowing everything I know today. Why? Why is there trash? So they helped me write those letters. And that just continued to where I was picking up trash with my grandfather as a kid, and I was leading my own little cleanups when I was in high school. So my activism is 40 more years. You know what I mean? So I've seen it and heard it all already. Every group and wave of whether it's been education or connectivity or get more people, get more feet in there. There's nothing new about what's going on now. It's already been going on before me. Started in the 60s up there. So, that's my thing. So I've been on the scene a long time. And that's where some of this passion you see coming from. Because I've been in the fight for a long time.
And real quick before, and just to speak a little more to what you asked in your statement, what we really would love to see is, one, we want to see, when it comes to visibility for our people, we want to see like the stuff you had mentioned where our names are returning to certain places, right? So we want to tell our story of not just our family, but our people in the mountains, right? There's a lot more we'd love to see down there in the LA area, but again, like my dad said, we try to stay in the areas that we have lineal descendancy from. So that's for us the San Gabriel Mountains, the Angeles National Forest, right? So we want to see that cultural return, of that culture being taught, being shared with the people, right? We want to develop educational programs, which we're working towards, and we have great relationships with, people who can help us realize those goals, right? But maybe that's somewhere where y'all could support us with. When you're in those discussions with others, right? When you're talking with people, we really would like to expedite that process, right? Because so much changes so quickly. When my dad's able to share, I can only regurgitate so much, right? We have to record it, we have to preserve it, and if something were to happen, it'd be devastating for our people. And it has been. When we lost our elder, Julia Bogany, she was a staple in our community, a pillar, a fierce woman who represented us on so many levels, just as a person, but also too in representation for our tribe at the local to the federal level. She had relationships that we unfortunately cannot bring back, right? or we just never knew she had, you know? There are things that she was doing that we'll never know because she was working on it on her own or with people that we never meet, right? So for us as a people, we're constantly working to share as much and get this to happen as quick as we can because we're on a time crunch.
Yeah.
We don't know what will happen. We've lost so many of our elders in the past, like 5 years, from the pandemic and other causes. It's been devastating. And when we lose those people, we're not going to get them back. And a lot of us are orators. We're writing books. We're trying to tell the stories, right? We're recording things now, but it all can't get preserved, right? So how can my dad, I always say this, and he's done great work with AUSD for 29 years, but as college and university professors and a president has said, he's the subject matter expert on these topics. Why isn't he teaching at a college, right? Is it because he doesn't have a PhD? This is stuff that you can't learn in any type of classroom setting, right? It's research that he's done on his own. He's doing what university level professors are doing, right? So how could you all support in that way as well, right? And two, speaking to the work we do, we want to be better land managers of the mountains. We want to be involved in these more conversations, right? We are, and there's a lot of progress happening, and trust me, there really is. But at the same time, we're on a time crunch. How could you support us in that, in the conversations and relationships and connectivity that you all have, right? So, that's a little bit to speak to what you're asking, right? But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I tried to hook him into it because you asked me a question, I'll be specific what you could do and how you could support us, but I wanted him to pull into it, and because he'll listen to me and say, oh, Dad's answering the question, but he's talking story around it and he might not get to it. And Nathan came in and did that, and that's important that he learns. He follows the way my grandfather taught me a lot of things. He didn't say always by words, but he follows that and he leads into that because one day he may have to replace me, and we're not sure, when that day could be. If you ask me how you could best support from where we stand and the work that we do, it calls into two things. One, I want future generations to look upon these mountains and see the same mountains my ancestors saw. Okay? I don't want to see the San Gabriel Mountains, the monument, turned into a park, a county park. It's not. It's a wilderness. A lot of it's wilderness. It's been set aside. Here to protect that. I want those same plants, those same animals that existed in the past. We've lost some already. I want it to look like that. I don't want it to look like a grassland or a desert. Okay? That's what I want. What else do I want? We want to protect our burial and ceremonial sites, most of which we'll keep secret. But that's the fight. We have to fight with, I'll be honest with you, the first wave of challenge came from the great hiking movement, not the one back in the 20s, the one that just happened in the 2000s. Because when they went through these books about hiking, what's the first thing they did? Oh, we've climbed all the peaks. Oh, there's a waterfall, a secret waterfall. Let's go find it. Let's go find this historical site. Let's go find this village site. Man, I was in a battle trying to keep our places hidden. Okay? And from other natives. The natives that have settled here. It's the second largest native population in the United States. Exists here in LA. And they were going into our mountains because they're trying to connect. The next wave's coming is the groups, to which we have many great relationships with. But I'm talking about the ones that are bringing people into the mountains, not necessarily the preservation or the people doing the work. And you have to find balance. These mountains are heavily accessed, visited. So we're trying to keep the fires down, we're trying to keep it clean, but we're also trying to keep the footprints where they should be. But discovery and curiosity leads people into places that maybe we shouldn't have them there right now. We have to protect some areas.
Our sacred sites, which we can't openly
so
share.
That's what I'm talking about, two things. Let's create a future to which generations from now can enter these mountains and see what I've seen and what my grandfather saw in generations before. And second, we want to protect our sites.
Lady in the back.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you, what work is being done on the land that 1 acre that you were gifted? I think it's in Pasadena, and how can we help you if you need help with that land?
And I believe they've set up a conservancy for that, and I think it's eventually probably they would best be asked directly, but to improve the facilities so that it can be a place of, ceremony, gathering, or celebration. Not everything we do is, I want you guys to know that, because the natives get characterized, everything that we do is a ceremony or a spiritual, thing. Well, sometimes we just got to get together and talk and have something to eat, just like everyone else. And I think that's what that site is intended to, to have, and I think that conservancy that was set up for that and funding directly to the Gabrielino San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, that could be used to improve that site, because I understand there's some issues with the facilities. And yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about, now my mind has gone completely blank.
It's okay.
Yeah, senior moment. Oh, I know what it was. So the places that are hidden,
Mhm.
but they're right now belonging to, a national forest or something. So
Great.
given that there's evidence there that these lands, these areas, these sacred sites belong to the first people here, I guess my question is there a way to somehow or other get ownership of those sites? Or at least stewardship of those sites? Because
Yeah.
they're archaeological sites, much more so than someplace that people get to go visit, right?
Yeah.
Archaeological sites you can't walk into.
Right.
I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, is there any movement in that?
Right.
Yeah, actually, yeah. And Nathan can answer part of it, and I'll answer part of it. One, I can't show our complete hand as to what our relationships are with the federal government, but I will say that the documentation and history that my family currently has, and we have one of the top genealogists, historians on it, is going to pave the way to a different future. As one of the forestry representatives said, this is unprecedented, and this is the first time we have a family who's, lineal descendants of a village within our monument. So that relationship right now is in development and growing, and we lead by example, as my son says. So what's first for us is taking care of the mountains, and these other things we believe over time will. But irrefutable evidence is dropping on them. You're talking to the people of the mountains. You know what I mean? For them, they're talking when they're talking to us. And that could eventually, we want to protect our sites, and we should be the caretakers of our own home. It's our house. Yeah, and that doesn't mean we want the whole San Gabriel Mountains, but specific areas, and we need to protect them. And and then the stewardship my son can get into a little bit.
Well, my dad had said that regards to our genealogy, we have very strong documentation of that, right? So that changes the whole dynamic of how we engage in these conversations with the Forest Service, because like I mentioned, we're not federally recognized. And when you're not federally recognized, it's difficult for the federal government to engage in those type of discussions.
Government to government.
Government to government relationship, right? So for us, since we have that lineal descendancy and documented, right, and we're in the process of soon to be sharing with them, that relationship can completely change. That's why it's been so important to our family to be able to, really well documented with a really well-known genealogist, but also, which is unfortunate, we have to do that, but it is where we're at, right? And it's going to help us realize some of what you had mentioned, right? And but it's a work in progress, because there's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, right? And a lot of things that we have to share, a lot of work that has to be done in terms of relationship building. Not all of our people have, their relationships with the different conservancies and agencies have not all been the best, right? So we're doing a lot of work to also, repair those relationships, right? And show that, there's a lot of things that we want to see for ourselves culturally, but also too broader themes we want to see for everybody here within the San Gabriel National Monument footprint, right? And that are recreating and going out to protect these spaces.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I want to take one more, I think we're going to do one more question.
Yeah.
We would love to keep answering all your questions, but we'll be here for the next 2 hours.
Yeah, there was a time that I spoke for 8 hours.
Yeah.
And I did not repeat myself, but I was challenged with those questions, and I can just keep going, so it's fun. Yeah, we'll answer another question.
We'll take one more question.
My question is, how many people, when you talk about us and we in that, how many people are you talking about within your group that are active?
Well, active, our current population that has the bloodline is probably 3,000, and active under 24. And those that are bringing it on the level I am today, 5 or 6.
And you're 2 of the 5 or 6.
Yeah, and what really separates me is not because I've been given some great gift of intelligence, it's because I'm relentless.
You're what?
Relentless. I don't stop learning. And yeah, it's what really drives me. So I was given a gift of being able to speak in public because my dad raised me that way. He had me shaking hands, telling me how to introduce myself to people when I was a little squirt. And reading and writing were the 2 most important things to me. And I was slow because I wanted to run in the mountains, not study. So because I love sports, you know how you got me to read well? You had me read the sports pages too. Yeah, and I love sports and I love USC football. And so when it was football season, he called everybody Jack. That was just his thing. He'd say, hey, Jack, there's an article in the paper about USC. We'll bring that, read that to me, because he pretended to be busy with something. So I became pretty good at articulating things, and then I'm an athlete. I'm used to crowds. I've been in big crowds. But it's just being relentless and wanting to learn. So our people need to be that way. It's important.